So let's talk about infectious disease. There's several syllabus objectives. Firstly, we need to differentiate between infectious and non-infectious diseases, talk about different types of pathogens, and also talk about these virulence factors. First of all, let's define what we mean by disease. Disease is any interruption to the normal function of an organism or parts of the body. We can divide disease into non-infectious diseases and infectious diseases. So what do we mean by infectious? It means it's able to be transmitted from one individual to another, from a host to another organism. And we can divide infectious diseases into contagious and non-contagious. A contagious disease is one that can be transmitted between two individuals of the same species. Okay, contagious means it can be spread between two individuals of the same species. Non-contagious cannot do that, but it's still infectious. Now, so not all diseases are infectious diseases. We also have non-infectious diseases. Now, infectious diseases are caused by pathogens. So what are pathogens? So if we break this down, pathos means disease and gen means generate. So pathogen or pathology generator. A pathogen is an agent that causes disease, and we can define pathogens as being pathology generators. And infectious disease, as I mentioned, can be transmitted from one organism to another. So here's some examples of different types of infectious diseases. Non-infectious diseases, as I mentioned, cannot be transmitted from one individual to another, and so that could be genetic, nutritional, or environmental. So we're going to focus primarily on infectious diseases. Now, pathogens are those infectious agents that can cause disease, pathology generators, and we can divide these up based on whether they are living organisms or cellular or non-cellular. So let's have a look at the cellular ones first. So they're actually made of a cell or multiple cells. So unicellular pathogens, bacteria, fungi, protists. Now, of course, not all bacteria is harmful, but harmful bacteria is a pathogen. We've also got multicellular pathogens, for example, worms and arthropods, which are often called parasites, but of course, these organisms are parasitic as well. Now, as well as cellular pathogens, we've also got non-cellular pathogens. They're not living things because they don't do all of those criteria of Mrs. Gren. For example, viruses don't reproduce. So they can't be considered cellular and they can't be considered living things. So viruses, and the other one is prions, which we're going to differentiate or discuss later. Now, so pathogens are parasitic. A parasite is something that lives on or in a host organism. It gets benefit from living on or in that host and can actually cause harm to the host. So we have parasites that live on an organism. They're ectoparasites, for example, fleas. And endoparasites live inside an organism, for example, worms and bacteria. Okay, so let's differentiate between contagious and non-contagious infectious diseases. Contagious diseases can be transmitted directly from one person to another, for example, COVID, flu. Non-contagious cannot be transmitted directly from one person to another. They require a vector. What do we mean by a vector? Is another organism that transfers the pathogen from one host to the other. So let's look at these living infectious agents. Bacteria, first of all, they're single-celled and they're prokaryotic. Now, most bacteria are not harmful. Some of them, like for example, in a human body, we've got more bacteria cells than we've got human cells. But we also have pathogenic bacteria that can cause disease. For example, the botulinum, Clostridium botulinum is a bacteria that produces a toxin called botulinum toxin, which we might know as Botox. It is a neurotoxin. Pathogenic bacteria can cause disease by producing toxins, by changing the host's metabolism and causing damage to tissues, etc. Here's some examples of different types of bacteria. Protozoa are from that tricky kingdom protists which don't fit anywhere else. But these protozoa are like animal-like protists. They're heterotrophic, unicellular, eukaryotic. One example is the Plasmodium, which causes malaria. But also Giardia is another example, and that causes amoebic dysentery. Now, we've got some fungi. Here's an example of a fungal infection, tinea, or ringworm, which is not really a worm, it's actually a fungus. So fungi are from the kingdom fungi. They're heterotrophic, eukaryotic. They actually spread using these things called hyphae. So hyphae are filaments that enter the cells, releasing digestive enzymes, and so they digest externally and then suck in the nutrients, and that's how they feed. So we can see examples of tinea, ringworm, thrush, etc., fungal infections. Now, if we think about these macro parasites, we've got roundworms, flatworms, fleas, etc. So these first three are endoparasites, and the flea is an ectoparasite because it's on the skin. All right, now let's have a look at the non-living pathogens. Viruses are non-living because they cannot reproduce on their own. Now, what they do is really quite ingenious. So they come along to the cell and they inject their DNA, and that DNA then takes over the cell and instructs the cell to make more viruses. So it takes over the machinery of the cell to manufacture more and more viruses. And so when it's full of viruses, it splits open, and then we get more viruses that spread to other cells, etc. So it basically makes the cells that it's taken over little virus-making factories. So that's how they spread really quickly. Prions are a type of infectious protein that causes disease by triggering abnormal folding of normal proteins in the brain. Prions are abnormally folded versions of a normally harmless protein. A classic example of this is mad cow disease. All right, so the last syllabus objective is looking at different factors and how they influence pathogenesis. So pathogenesis is pathology generation, generating pathology. And then we can call these things virulence factors. So virulence is the measure of the pathogenicity of an organism. And pathogenicity is the capacity of a pathogen to cause disease. Okay, so virulence is what is the capacity of this pathogen to cause disease? Basically, for a pathogen to cause disease, it needs to be able to get on and get in a cell and needs to be able to reproduce and avoid being captured. Then it needs to be able to cause damage. So let's have a look at these. These are called virulence factors. So adherence factors are those factors that help a pathogen get on to a cell. Helps it bind to the host cell surface. So it might have things like adhesions that help it to stick to the cell. Then it needs to get in. So invasion factors are all about being able to drill down using enzymes to be able to break down the cell membrane to then be able to squeeze in, so get the actual bacterium inside the cell or inside the organism. Now, one of the ways in which organisms can evade being captured is by having a capsule around the pathogen. So bacteria, for example, can often have a large polysaccharide layer around the bacteria cell. And basically what that does is it helps it avoid being captured and helps it avoid being eaten. So it inhibits phagocytosis. Another virulence factor is how much damage it can cause. So we have these things called toxins, which are released by the bacteria that actually cause damage to the cells of an organism.